Hello and welcome to UiPath Essentials Training, User Interface Recording. In this tutorial, you'll learn the basics of using the recorder, getting information out of apps, and parameterization of the recorded workflow. Along the way, you'll pick up a few other tips and tricks and differences between several methods for automation. You should already be familiar with the UiPath interface and workflow, flowcharts and sequences, and passing variables between actions, as we'll use these concepts throughout this tutorial. So, if you're ready, let's begin. Today we'll focus on recording, and we'll use 3 apps to show you how to automate them. The Notepad app and browser, to show you basic principles and workflow, and a custom demo expense app for a more practical example. First, the recorder. It works in a similar fashion to other macro recording apps like AutoHotkey and Automator, but on steroids. UiPath allows you to record and replay actions, but goes much further than that by allowing you to modify and parameterize the recorded sequence. It's a great way to start your automation process because it gives you a workflow that you can use as a framework to build upon. UiPath has 4 types of recording: Basic, Desktop, Web, and Citrix. Basic and Desktop are almost identical in behavior, with a small difference that we'll learn about in a minute. They're used for recording most desktop applications that you may work with. Web recording is very similar to the first 2, but made for the specific requirements of browsers and web apps. And Citrix is for recording virtual machines, VNC, and of course Citrix environments. Whilst at its core it's fundamentally different from the other 3 methods, most actions have similar counterparts in all types of recording. Let's see a basic example of writing something in Notepad and changing the font. Not anything groundbreaking, but it'll get you acquainted with how the recorder works for all 4 types of recording. We'll use the quick access toolbar that you learned about in the introductory training. The record button presents the 4 available recording options. Since we'll be recording Notepad, a desktop app, we can use basic or desktop recording. We'll use the basic one for now. All 4 types of recording start with this recording controller. As you can see, there are a few more actions that it can perform, but for now, click on Automatic Recorder to start recording. This blue rectangle is showing you the element that UiPath recognizes. It means that you can click it, get data from it, or otherwise interact with it. Click on the editable area. This small window pops up with a few options: special keys and modifiers that you can add, the option to hide the typed characters for password fields, and this empty field that you'll use quite a lot. Now type some text and hit enter. Then we'll go to Format, Font, and change the font to, let's say, Kandara. Then hit OK. And to stop recording, hit Escape. Then click Save and Exit, or hit Escape again to save the recording. Let's see what it looks like. The recorded sequence is all inside this block. New recordings are not connected to anything to give you the choice of how to use it. So as it is, it will not run. To connect it to the Start block, we'll right-click on it and choose Set as Start Node. Inside, you can see all the actions you performed. In this case, all 4 of them. Here's the text you entered, where you clicked Format, then Font, and how you chose the Kandara font, and then clicked OK. These images associated with each action are informative, and they don't affect the workflow in any way. They're just there to make the whole workflow easier to read, and you can change or delete them from the drop-down menu of each action. Now, let's run it to see if it all works. It looks like it typed after the text that was already there. That's because we didn't check the empty field box in the input field. We can easily fix that now by clicking on the Type Into action and checking Empty Field. And you can't see the effect the font change had because it was already set to Kandara. Let's change it to Cooper. That would be nice and visible. And let's run again. Okay, now that may be a horrible font choice, but at least the workflow behaves as it should. So, now would be a good time to let you know what the recorder actually records and what it doesn't. It records left clicks on buttons, checkboxes, and other clickable elements, and also typing into editable fields. It doesn't record keyboard shortcuts, modifier keys like Control and Alt key, right clicks, mouse hover, and other similar actions. On to the next recording mode, desktop. To better understand the difference, we'll record the same actions using the desktop recorder. We'll type the same text, but this time we'll check empty field. Let's also change the size instead of the font, just for variation. And hit Escape to exit the recording mode, and Escape again to save and exit. Connect this new recording to the Start node and double-click to peek inside. As you can see, while the actions performed are virtually identical, desktop recording produces a more complex workflow. In this recording mode, all actions performed are nested inside an attach window container. In our workflow, there are 3 attach window containers because there are actually 3 windows. The first one is for the actual Notepad window, and it contains the typed text and the action to click on Format. The second container is for the menu that pops up. The operating system considers it a new window. And the third one is the font dialog window, where we changed the font or the size and then clicked the OK button. So, what are these containers for? They're for those special situations when you want to ensure that other windows of the same application don't interfere with your workflow. UiPath uses the name of the app, the title of the window, the current open file, and other such details to ensure that it correctly identified the right window. But there are cases when all of these are identical. Like if you open 2 untitled Notepad windows at the same time, or 2 instances of the same application. If not enclosed in an attach window container, UiPath would run on the topmost window and could run into problems. So, if you perform more than one action in a window, it's safer to use desktop recording to avoid interference. Now that you have the basics down, let's get to the juicy stuff. Coming back to our basic workflow, we'll parameterize some parts of it and modify some actions. Let's say we wanted the entered text to be something that we can dynamically change, not hard-coded into the workflow as it is now. We'll just replace the text, currently in quotations, with a variable name. We'll create a new one called type text. It'll also appear down here in the variables pane. It's a type of string, which is correct, and we'll give it a value. Let's say this is actually a variable. It's a good idea to also change the scope to main to be able to modify its value from outside this sequence. And let's run it. Right, looks like it worked. Next, let's modify this select item action to make it change the font size instead of the font face. Most recorded actions have a handy option here in the drop-down menu called Indicate on Screen. It allows us to point to a new element different than the one we recorded. But to be able to point to the font size, we first have to open Notepad's Format window and then go to Indicate on Screen. And run. Okay, but what do you do if you want to click a more ephemeral element, like the drop-down menu? You can't do that because the click will register as clicking on the format item. What you need to do is to temporarily pause the recording by pressing F2, so you can open menus or other elements that can automatically hide themselves. So, F2, pause, open the menu, and wait for the countdown to start recording again. All right. Now, let's say you want to get the current font instead of changing it. This will also get you acquainted with a new concept. Manual recording is the process of telling UiPath to do all those actions that cannot be recorded automatically. Things like keyboard shortcuts, modifier keys, getting text out of apps, finding images and elements, interacting with the clipboard, and many others that you can find in the Activities pane. So, to get to the font, we'll start a new recording. We'll open the font window as usual, but here's the difference. To add an unrecordable action, we'll hit Escape to pause the recording, then in the recording controller, we go to the action that we want to perform, in this case, text, and copy text to get the current font, and we'll indicate the element we want to get. Let's continue recording to close this font window. So, hit record, then click the cancel button, then hit escape to pause and exit the recording. Let's go ahead and connect this new recording to the start node and have a look inside. All of these actions are similar to the other ones except the get text action that was introduced manually. Let's add a write line to test that it works. First, we copy the output variable from the get text action. Then we drag a write line action at the end of the workflow and paste the variable in it to print to the output. And that's how you get current font. This can of course be extrapolated to any type of data or app. Great, you're doing good so far. Now, let's try a more complex example. We have here a dummy expense app. It's useful for learning because it comes preloaded with values and other possible interactions. So, it's great for trying out workflows on it. It has this second window where you can enter expenses and it calculates the total here. We're going to add a new expense and get the total to print it out to the output, and I'll give you a quick intro for fixing possible problems with recording. So, we'll start with a new basic recording. Press the automatic recorder to start recording and click on Create Expense Report to get to the calculator. Here, we'll add a new expense for research and check the empty field checkbox and a value of 100. Now, just like before, we'll pause the recording by pressing Escape and manually add a Get Text action by going to Text and Copy Text, then click on the result. We want to close this window too, so we'll continue recording by pressing the automatic recorder again and clicking Cancel to close the window. Then Escape to stop and save and exit. Connect this new recording to the start node and open it up. Here are all the recorded actions: create expense, add expense, typing the new values, getting the text, and pressing cancel. Let's run it to see how it works. It looks like it works, but it's writing in the same field on the 6th row because that's where we typed. But we'll leave it as it is for now. Let's remove the add expense action because since it writes it in the same place, we don't need it. And let's change the value to 200 for testing. And we'll print the result to the output window with a write line action. Copy the output variable from getText, the one that gets the result, to the write line action. It looks like it got stuck right after typing 200. Let's stop and see what's wrong. Okay, so the get text is not working anymore, although it was working the last time we tested. To see what's wrong, I'll have to tell you a bit about a very important part of UiPath, selectors. Every recorded action has a selector, found here in the target section. A selector is like a recipe for finding the correct element on screen, or like a file path in Windows, except a bit more complex. So, when UiPath has trouble finding an element, check the selector to make sure that it works. This down here is the actual selector, and these are the attributes it uses to form the recipe. But you'll learn a lot more about selectors later in a dedicated training. For now, we just know that this selector doesn't work exactly as it should. Here's an easy fix. See this attached to live element here? This is almost identical to the indicate on screen that each recorded action has in the drop-down menu. If you press it and indicate the result again, UiPath understands that the current selector, or recipe, fails to identify an element, and it tries to fix the selector. So, the 377 disappeared. Now let's see if it worked. And it did. We got our correct value in the output window. As always, printing it to the output is just for demo purposes. You can insert it into a database, email it, save it in an Excel file, or whatever else you may need. Next, let's see a web recording example. Of all other 3 recording modes, web recording is most similar to desktop recording, and you'll see why in a minute. For this example, we'll search for a specific stock on Google Finance and calculate the difference between the last 2 opening days. If the stock dropped more than a few points, we'll show an alert. We'll start by going to Recording, Web, and Automatic Recorder as usual. Then we'll type the name of the specific stock that we want to investigate in the search field. Let's see how Tesla is doing. Check the empty field checkbox to delete any existing text and click the search button to go directly to Tesla stock. Then we'll go to Historical Prices to get the stock price for the last 2 days. As in the previous examples, we'll press Escape to pause the recording and get the values by going to Text and Copy Text, and then again for the second value. For the purpose of this exercise, we'll also go back to the initial Google Finance page. So, Record, back button twice, and Escape to save and exit. Connect the sequence to the start node and let's examine it. You can see the similarities with the desktop recording mode. All actions are inside an attached browser container to keep them from interfering with other browser windows. All the actions are here, including the get text actions, but it looks like the back buttons are considered as part of another window. That's fine. Now, let's add a write line action to see the difference between the last 2 days' stock price. We'll drop it here between the 2 attached window containers. The names of the generated variables are TD and TD1. Let's make that TD1 and TD2 down here in the variables pane, just because it's easier to understand. Then write TD2 minus TD1 to print the difference. And it looks like it considers the 2 values as being of type string. But that's just a guess UiPath is making, because we can see down here that the actual type is generic, which means they don't really have a specific type. So here's a trick that we'll use quite a lot, to tell UiPath to consider them numbers instead of strings. To do that, we need to start the subtraction with a number. This way, there's no confusion about the type of operation we want. Similarly, if we would want to force it to consider the operators strings, we'd start the line with a string. But in our case, we'll just add 0+ at the beginning of the operation. Let's see. And we got the correct difference here in the output window. Good. Now that works, let's save this difference into a new variable. Let's say diff, and copy this operation here. We'll delete the write line since we don't need it anymore. We wanted to see if the price dropped by more than a specific value. Now we can do that with an if statement. If difference is bigger than, let's say, 8 points, show me a message box saying, the stock has dropped by this many points. The plus sign works for strings too, it just sticks them together. And because we started with a string, it'll know that we want to add the strings together. But diff is a number, so we need to convert it to a string by adding period to string. Don't worry, you'll learn more about strings and other formats in a later training. Then, we'll copy this action and paste it in the else section to show a different message when the stock hasn't dropped more than 8 points. Let's also see how it works for a different stock, like Microsoft, and run. Okay, that worked, but apparently something else went wrong. Let's stop and investigate. So, it stopped after we got the message box. So this means for some reason it can't find the back button. Maybe we need to fix this attach window selector. Let's have a look. Right, it looks like it's trying to find a window that contains something about Tesla. And that's obviously wrong since we want to search for different stocks, not just Tesla. Let's uncheck this box. And let's see the selector for the back button. Okay, generic, no Tesla related stuff in here. Let's see, but first let's go back to the original page and run. Okay. And it went back to google.com/finance. Perfect. So now that's done, let's finish it off by making it open the browser and going to the Google Finance website and then close it after all the actions are performed. But first, it's good practice to make a copy of the current workflow in case we somehow mess it up. Copy, paste, and connect it to the start node. We'll add the Open Browser action at the very beginning of the workflow. It looks very similar to the Attach Browser container below, including the Do container inside it. That's quite helpful. So we'll delete this one and drag the other one in, like so. And delete this now empty container. Then we need to tell it the URL where to open the browser, in this case, Google Finance. Okay, and add a close application at the very end. We'll put it inside the attach window container. This way, the close application action knows which application to close. And run it. Okay, it opened a new browser window, made the search, gave us the good news, and then closed. And that's how you get data from web sources and take decisions based on it. That is the end of our user interface recording training. But before you go, it's time for a quick recap. You learned about the 4 types of recording available in UiPath: Basic, Desktop, Web, and Citrix. There's a specialized Citrix recording tutorial, so in this one, you learned about the first 3, which are similar. We recorded a few notepad interactions using basic and desktop recording and learned how to manually add actions during the recording. Then you mastered parameterization, replacing static parameters of the recorded actions with dynamic data using variables. You saw how to interact with a custom expense calculator and get data from any application for later use. And finally, how to do all of that and more in a web browser. I hope you had fun, and I'll see you for the next video. Goodbye.